surprise, new Kendrick Lamar album. Yeah, well, I guess you could say that. This is entitled Untitled Unmastered. It's actually a collection of 8 tracks that were written around the same time as To Pimp a Butterfly. Some of them were slated to be on the album, however, for one reason or the other, they didn't end up on there. They're demos, they are considered to be fairly raw. There's a little bit of a misnomer that I will kind of say right out of the gate, is the fact that if an artist released an album of demos that had this quality of sound to them, because this is very well polished, at least in my opinion, maybe by comparison to other albums like it, other hip-hop discs, especially in this age, it might be considered to be a little less than polished, but man, this is really, it sounds very, very rich, is what I'm saying. Now, on the 6th track of this album, Cee-lo Green has an appearance and utters the line, am I mortal man or make-believe? And this is very fitting, considering some people could ask that about Kendrick Lamar. They really could. He's pretty much become the heir to the hip-hop throne, and even though we just talked about a Kanye West album in February, and Kanye, of course, considers himself a genius and the greatest artist of all time, I think in reality, Kendrick is the one who has ascended past that rank. Another thing that is very interesting about this disc is the fact that some in the community have considered it to be sort of similar to the Life of Pablo in a way, in the fact that it's just sort of relaxed and doesn't completely take itself seriously. And if I were to make a comparison point after listening to this to those criticisms, it's the fact that it's more like the second half of the Life of Pablo that actually has a little bit more cohesiveness to it. Considering this feels very much like it was, even though they're just demos, even though they're things that weren't used for To Pimp a Butterfly, their placement and everything was very carefully considered for this release. There's a lot of cohesiveness that feels very present here. It's not something that feels like it jumps all over the place. So these are 8 tracks. They don't have titles to them whatsoever. They were written between the years of 2013 and 2016. So the last one has been polished as of this year. And the one thing that you're going to note on here is that some of the stylistic similarities that you heard on To Pimp a Butterfly are certainly present within these demos. So there was certainly a mindset that was somewhat being considered for this disc, and really the exploration of that mindset is what made To Pimp a Butterfly such a diverse and just glorious record, very well tailored and very well thought out. And these demos showcase that the real train of thought that was going on during the recording and the writing of this album really suited that. And what I dig about this album is that, like To Pimp a Butterfly, there's a wide variety of influence, but there's a lot drawing from old funk and jazz, a little bit of blues, and you will hear a wide variety of instrumentalization in these beats. You will hear some strange instruments that perhaps don't seem like they would have much of a place in a hip-hop record these days. And the one instrument that makes the most note to me is the xylophone, which we hear on the aforementioned track 6. It's the one that's in the background a little bit. But I really love the funk aspect that you hear on this, that also combines with that jazz element. Track 5, Untitled 5, is a beautiful representation of this. Very well done, very well crafted, and a couple of these tracks, 2 of them actually, are somewhat related to a couple of performances, a pair of performances that Kendrick had done earlier here in 2016 on the Colbert Report, or Late Night with Stephen Colbert, rather, and another show. And actually, there's a part of this that was partially taken from the Grammy performance, though not very much of that. But what is probably the highlight that many people will see on this album is the 7th track on this, considering it is 8 minutes in length. It's actually a triptych of tracks that is probably the most raw out of everything that's on this disc, with perhaps the lone exception of the 1 near 2 minute long 4th track, which is one that it contains these sort of subliminal whispers and speaks a little bit about the education system. And this is a record that has that political backbone to it a little bit. It's something that is within there. There's some talk about immigration and the differences between the races and the differences between the cultures here in America. And another thing that is ever present is a concept of religion that is slightly present there, but also the phrase "pimp, pimp, hooray," which quite frankly, it would have been a very strange little idea to have on To Pimp a Butterfly, to have that idea on there and have it be a central theme as it is on this. It's actually a theme on this little, untitled, unmastered album, because we hear this about 3 or 4 different places on this disc overall. So even with some folks saying that this has a little bit more of that relaxed, a little bit more of that perhaps unbalanced ideal that is going along with it, considering these are, demos and things that just didn't make the cut, there's still cohesion, almost as though there was a plan for another theme, so an added piece of themology to Pimp a Butterfly that just didn't pan out, which is kind of incredible to me that something that simple could draw such an aesthetic to mind. There are some notable folks that are part of this. There is a couple verses from J-Rock on a track. Cee-lo Green, of course, is on track number 6, and I have to say, what happened to Cee-lo? I really have to say that, a couple years ago, had one of the biggest songs of that calendar year. Of course, we're talking about Fuck You, and it seems like ever since then, he's sort of just been known as this the special guest extraordinaire on songs and albums, and so, I understand this is probably already a very lengthy review that's not talking too deep about the music. I'm very, very mystified by the lore of this album, and that is very much being represented here. But, I don't talk about this stuff very often. I don't talk about folks like Lamar and Cee-lo Green very often, so these are questions that come up whenever I'm thinking and going through the thought process of these reviews. So, is Cee-lo somebody who has it in him to write a prominent album, and he's made all of these friends and has all of these very successful allies that he easily could use to craft just something pretty magnificent, at least in my opinion, because he has a very solid voice, and he is a very eclectic individual, has that old school soul sound. But at any rate, he lends his voice for track 6 of this album here, and it's a very nice touch. In fact, it gives track 6 the overall aura of a 1970s funk track that has that pop crossover, and if you think about folks like the Isley Brothers and that variety, where you hear a little bit of a crossover sound, but at its root it has that sort of like pop sensibility and that smooth groove, that smooth feel. That's exactly what you get with this, and it is one that resonates quite nicely. Overall, this album as a whole resonates quite nicely. There is very little on this disc that feels truly 100% too raw to be considered, at least, this was something that was being seriously considered for To Pimp a Butterfly. So these are songs that were further along in the development process than perhaps what some people consider demos, which would sound like it was being recorded by, one of those, talkback devices Kevin McAllister used in Home Alone 2. But I love the structure of this disc. I love the fact that it has themology, even though it's technically just an album full of demos. And the creative process that is on here really bears in mind a couple of other U words that are very similar to this album's title, to Untitled Unmastered. I think it's at times very unconventional, but that's something that we've learned to expect from Kendrick. It's something that is really unrivaled at this point. There are few artists that are willing to dive into this sort of artistic side of hip-hop. A lot of the big boys seem to really like big processed beats. Those that dive into something that's a little more unconventional certainly tend to really spark conversation a little bit more. And Kendrick uses a nice level of balance. He doesn't have an uneven frame of mind whenever it comes to overall construction, because Kanye will use some very artistic beats and try to go for the whole artist angle, and it will come off as extremely pretentious, either that or there will be a very lack of balance there. With the first half of The Life of Pablo really proves that. But Kendrick always seems to have that balance in mind and sort of a great mindset as to what he wants the vision to be. And I think finally is that he's becoming, and by this I mean Kendrick Lamar, kind of uncontested, the real king of hip-hop right now. Whenever you have an album right here that is filled with unmastered, untitled gems, demos, tracks that were meant to be on To Pimp a Butterfly but didn't make it, and you make a solid and cohesive product such as this one that very easily stands on its own as a 34-minute long, mini album or whatever, one that makes its own statements, one that's able to really cross its own lines and, not really peddle an agenda, but still use enough metaphor and use enough creative guise in order to really showcase and sort of suggest ideas. It's really kind of amazing. Kendrick right now is further along on a musical plateau than maybe any band that we talk about typically on this channel. Kendrick right now is really in a position where, at least it seems like during the To Pimp a Butterfly sessions, he was just on a roll. He could do no wrong because, man, these compositions are a lot of fun to listen to. They're interesting to listen to, and they keep you gripped. He has a presence to himself, and any character that he uses, even just his standard voice, has a presence to itself, a confidence to itself, but also one that really, it has this very respectful vibe of we need to look a little bit further, we need to think a little bit harder, and we need to consider some of the consequences for some of the actions that we have taken. I think that Kendrick has a voice that speaks a little bit more toward the hearts, minds, and especially the brains of his listeners, aside from other hip-hop stars, aside from a Kanye West. We've been using that as a comparison point all review long. We might as well just stay with it. I'm not going to give this a score because this is, technically speaking, just demos and such. It's not really a brand new album or anything like that. It's great to hear new music from Kendrick, don't get me wrong, but it's something that it provides a lot of insight for the To Pimp a Butterfly sessions. It provides a lot of insight to how those influences and how the varied frame of mind, the framework of that disc came to be, and how these tracks really seem to fit that philosophy tremendously. The 3-part triptych track, the 8-minute long 7th track on this is probably the biggest example of something very raw, something that feels a little bit unfinished, but it also it maintains its own symbolic nature, especially the final portion of this song, which sounds essentially just like studio conversation, and really kind of provides a little bit of a window to where one man is by comparison to another as far as priorities are concerned. As one final note, the last track on this disc reminded me a lot of King Kunta, but I guess that's kind of been a typical idea, so I'm along with the pack on that one, I guess, but whatever. Great disc. I recommend checking this out. It's available on iTunes and Spotify. Not sure if this is going to get a conventional CD release. Maybe it'll get a limited run. I kind of hope it does, because I'd really like to have a physical copy of this. This is really neat, really cool stuff. What do you think about it? What do you think about this? Can Kendrick Lamar do any wrong right now? Seriously, let me know in the comments. I'm CoverkillerNation. I'll talk to you later. Peace.